The voicemail was barely audible at first. It sounded like breathing, then a shaky laugh, then silence so long it felt intentional. And just before the message ended, Annie Kosbach whispered something that her mother would replay hundreds of times afterward, trying to convince herself she heard it wrong. ... He's acting weird. That was it. No crying, no panic, just for soft words spoken, like Annie already knew something terrible was circling around her, even if she couldn't fully see it yet. By the next afternoon, search teams would be standing near the Jordan River, staring at a single red shoe lying beside blood smeared across a pedestrian bridge. Detectives would call the scene violent, reporters would call it unimaginable, but Annie's parents would remember something much smaller: the way she hesitated before leaving the house, the way she turned back once, like she wanted to say something, and then decided not to. And for years afterward, one question kept haunting everyone involved. Who was Annie afraid of during her final hours? Annie Kosk spent most of her childhood moving through systems that were supposed to protect her. Foster homes, social workers, temporary bedrooms that never felt permanent. By the time she was adopted by the Kosbach family, people around her said she already carried herself differently than other kids her age. She was cautious, hyper-aware, like someone who had learned very early that happiness could disappear without warning. But despite everything, Annie still had this softness to her. Teachers described her as deeply emotional and eager to be loved. Friends remembered how quickly she became attached to people, how badly she wanted stability. When the Kosbachs adopted her, Annie finally started talking about the future like it was something real. She decorated her room obsessively, filled journals with plans, drew little sketches of the life she wanted someday. But beneath that hopeful version of Annie, there was another side nobody fully understood. She hated conflict. Even tiny arguments affected her deeply. And in the weeks before she disappeared, people close to her noticed her mood shifting constantly. One moment she was excited, almost glowing, and the next she seemed distracted and distant. At school, friends said she kept checking her phone during class, smiling at messages sometimes, other times staring at the screen with this frozen expression that made people uncomfortable. When someone finally asked her what was wrong, Annie gave a nervous laugh and said, "Everything's complicated right now." Then she changed the subject so quickly it felt rehearsed. The boy everyone eventually focused on was Darwin Beck. He was only 14 at the time, quiet and awkward in a way that adults often describe as harmless. Annie was completely drawn to him. Friends said she talked about him constantly, like she had attached all her hopes to this relationship working out. But the relationship itself was messy from the beginning. They fought often, broke up, and got back together repeatedly. Annie told people Darwin could become cold without warning, like a switch flipped inside him. One day he'd tell her he loved her, the next he'd ignore her completely. And Annie, desperate not to lose him, kept trying harder every time he pulled away. Then Annie started telling people something shocking. She said she was pregnant. The stories spread quickly through her friend group, because Annie seemed completely convinced it was true. She talked about running away, about starting over somewhere else with Darwin. At first, her friends thought it sounded like teenage fantasy, but Annie wasn't joking. She wrote about it in journals, planned conversations in advance. She even marked notes in her planner about when Darwin would find out. But privately, Annie's parents were confused because they had already made her take a pregnancy test weeks earlier, and it came back negative. Still, Annie continued acting as though the pregnancy was real, and according to investigators later, that lie may have changed everything. The night Annie vanished didn't begin with screaming or chaos. It began with an argument so ordinary nobody realized it would matter later. Annie fought with her parents over rules, over leaving the house, over the people she had been spending time with. Witnesses would later say she stormed out emotional and frustrated, carrying the kind of anger teenagers usually return home from a few hours later. But Annie never came back. As the evening dragged on, her parents became uneasy. Calls went unanswered, texts stopped delivering, and eventually, fear replaced irritation. Meanwhile, somewhere near the Jordan River Parkway, something horrifying was unfolding. The next morning, a person walking near the bridge noticed blood on the concrete. Not a drop, Not a smear, enough blood to stop someone in their track. Nearby sat a single shoe, a red, small. Detectives arrived expecting to find an assault victim nearby, maybe injured and wandering somewhere in shock. Instead, search teams scanning the riverbanks discovered a body downstream. The injuries were so catastrophic authorities initially struggled to identify her. Ani had suffered devastating blunt force trauma to her head and face. Investigators would later say the attack was intensely personal, excessive, emotional, the kind of violence that usually came from someone who knew the victim. For Annie's family, the days after her death felt unreal. Reporters crowded near their home while detectives searched through Annie's bedroom piece by piece. Every notebook mattered, every text message mattered, and almost immediately, investigators noticed contradictions everywhere. Annie had been lying to different people about different things. Some friends believed she planned to run away willingly. Others said she seemed scared recently. One girl told police Annie had confessed that Darwin didn't want the baby. Another claimed Annie seemed terrified of disappointing him. The deeper detectives looked into Annie's private life, the more tangled everything became. Then the investigation suddenly veered in another direction entirely. A woman named Joanna Franklin came forward claiming she had witnessed Annie's murder. She accused a violent local man with a criminal history named Daniel Ferry. The allegation exploded through the investigation like gasoline. Detectives chased the lead aggressively. Ferry and another man became primary suspects almost overnight. Search warrants were executed. Interrogations followed. Rumors spread everywhere. And for a while, it genuinely looked like police had solved the case. But then cracks started appearing in the story. Witness timelines didn't match. Physical evidence failed to connect. Slowly, investigators realized the entire lead might have been fabricated. And while police chased dead ends, Annie's real killer quietly disappeared back into normal life. What made the case especially disturbing was how young everyone involved seemed. Annie was 15, Darwin was 14. Detectives struggled to reconcile the brutality of the crime scene with the image of a shy teenage boy. Teachers described him as withdrawn but polite. Neighbors barely remembered him speaking. Even some investigators reportedly questioned whether someone so young could commit such extreme violence. But small details kept pulling attention back toward him. Tiny inconsistencies, nervous behavior, a growing number of statements from Annie's friends suggesting Darwin had become increasingly angry after Annie claimed she was pregnant. One friend later described a conversation that chilled detectives. Annie had apparently told Darwin she wanted them to leave together and raise the baby. Instead of excitement, Darwin reacted with panic. According to witnesses, he became distant afterward, irritated, cold, and Annie noticed it immediately. In text messages recovered later, her tone shifted dramatically. She stopped sounding dreamy and hopeful. Instead, she sounded anxious, like she was trying desperately to keep someone from leaving her. Detectives began wondering if Annie's pregnant lie had spiraled further than she ever intended, and whether she realized too late how dangerous the situation had become. Years passed before investigators finally broke through the case. For Annie's family, that delay felt unbearable. Every holiday arrived carrying the same unanswered questions. Every birthday became another reminder that her killer was still free. Detectives quietly kept rebuilding the case from the beginning, rechecking timelines and evidence that had been buried beneath false leads, and eventually, they found something incredibly small that changed everything. Blood on a shoe. Investigators determined Annie's blood had transferred onto Darwin's shoe during the attack. It was the kind of evidence almost impossible to explain away, but even then, the full picture remained incomplete. Detectives believed Annie met Darwin willingly near the river that night. There were no signs she expected violence, no defensive preparation, which meant the attack likely erupted suddenly during an argument, and according to prosecutors, that argument centered around Annie insisting she was pregnant. Detectives theorized Darwin panicked, believing his life was about to collapse before it had even begun. When investigators finally confronted Darwin with the growing evidence, they noticed something unsettling about his demeanor. He didn't react emotionally the way they expected. No visible grief, no outrage, just nervous calculation. like someone trying to keep too many stories straight at once. Then detectives uncovered text messages sent after Annie's death that appeared to show Darwin attempting to distance himself from the crime and manipulate how people viewed him. One investigator later described the messages as the behavior of someone hiding panic beneath normal conversation. The murder weapon itself painted an even darker picture. Authorities believed Annie had been struck repeatedly with a shovel, not once, repeatedly. The violence wasn't impulsive in the way people imagine teenage fights becoming deadly. It continued far beyond that point. Annie's injuries suggested rage, fear, desperation. Prosecutors would later argue Darwin attacked Annie because he believed she had trapped him, but people close to Annie saw it differently. They believed Annie wasn't trying to manipulate anyone. She was a deeply damaged girl, clinging to the fantasy of being loved permanently by someone she trusted. Then came the twist that stunned even people closely following the case. Annie was never pregnant. The entire motive behind the murder appeared to be built on something that wasn't even real. Investigators confirmed the earlier pregnancy test had been negative. Annie's journals revealed confusion, emotional instability, and desperate attempts to hold on to her relationship with Darwin. Detectives started realizing the tragedy wasn't just about violence. It was about two emotionally immature teenagers spiraling inside fantasies they were incapable of handling. Annie created a lie because she feared abandonment. Darwin responded with unimaginable violence because he believed the lie was true for Annie's family. But that revelation was devastating in a completely different way. It meant Annie died over something imaginary, something fragile and temporary that could have disappeared with a single honest conversation. Instead, fear escalated into murder. And perhaps the most horrifying detail was this. According to prosecutors, Annie likely realized during her final moments that Darwin intended to kill her long before the attack actually ended, which meant somewhere beside that river, the 15-year-old girl understood that the person she trusted most had become the thing she should have feared all along. Darwin Bagshaw was eventually arrested years after the murder, found living quietly out of state while Annie's family remained trapped in grief back in Utah. By then, he was older, taller, outwardly calmer. The detective said the case never stopped haunting them because of how ordinary everything appeared on the surface. No masked predator, no criminal mastermind, just two teenagers whose emotional chaos spiraled into irreversible horror. During court proceedings, details emerged slowly and painfully. The prosecution described Annie's final moments: the bridge, the river, the repeated blows. People inside the courtroom reportedly broke down listening. Then, Darwin pleaded guilty. No dramatic confession, no emotional apology powerful enough to explain what happened. Just guilty. Annie's family finally received legal closure, but closure felt meaningless compared to what had been taken from them. Her mother later described the emptiness of walking past Annie's bedroom years afterward and still expecting to hear movement inside, still expecting her daughter to come home. That's the cruel thing about violent loss. The mind keeps rejecting it long after reality settles in. In the end, investigators concluded the truth was horrifyingly simple. Annie believed love could save her. She spent most of her life searching for permanence, for someone who wouldn't leave. Darwin became that hope. And when she sensed him slipping away, she created a story she thought would keep him close forever. Instead, it cornered him emotionally. Detectives believe Darwin invited Annie to meet him near the river to talk privately. At some point during that conversation, panic turned into rage. He picked up a shovel and attacked her with enough force to nearly erase her identity completely. Then he left her body in the freezing river and walked away, believing the current would carry the truth with it, but it didn't. Years later, the case still unsettles people because nothing about it feels distant or monstrous enough to comfortably separate from normal life. There was no elaborate conspiracy, no stranger lurking in shadows, just insecurity, fear, emotional immaturity, and one catastrophic decision made in seconds that destroyed multiple families forever. Annie's story lingers because it feels painfully human, right until the moment it becomes horrifying beyond comprehension. But maybe that's the part people never truly get over. The fact that Annie left home believing she was going to talk to someone she loved, While he was already deciding whether she would come back alive,